Hello. I'd like to welcome everybody who has signed into this important public forum to discuss the action track number 1 theme, ensure access to safe and nutritious food for all. My name is Tom Arnold. I am a member of the Champions Network of the Food System Summit. I work closely in a number of areas with the chairman of the Action Track 1, Lawrence Haddad, and I was very pleased when Lawrence asked me to moderate the session this afternoon. We have a very interesting theme, we have a very interesting panel, and I want to make sure that all of the people who are participating in the presentations will stick to their time allocation so that we maximize the amount of time that the members of this forum, the people who are signed up to this forum, can contribute and exchange views. So that is our overall objective for the next 2 hours, and I hope it's going to be as productive as possible. I think you all know the rules for participating in sessions like this, and it's about keeping your microphone muted. And also that if you wish to ask a question, indicate in the normal way, and that's how we will capture your views. So I'd like to begin then by calling on Jamie Morrissey of the FAO. Jamie is the Director of Food Systems and Food Safety Division in the FAO, but for the purposes of today, importantly, he's the UN Anchor of Action Track 1. So Jamie, could we call on you to introduce our session today? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom, and hello to everybody. I'll just say a few words on what the motivation for the Food Systems Summit is, and try to set the framing for the rest of the discussion, which will focus in on Action Track 1. So 2 key reasons provided the initial motivation for the summit. Firstly, the fact that food system transformation provides an obvious entry point for accelerating progress towards the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. These goals require that countries work to eliminate hunger and all forms of malnutrition, but at the same time do so while creating growth and employment opportunities needed to eradicate poverty, sustaining biodiversity and natural resource services, and addressing growing pressures of climate change. Now, clearly, many contemporary food systems have been underperforming. Over 3 billion people are unable to afford a healthy diet. Food systems are exacting a significant toll on the natural resource environment. They're becoming less resilient, and they're not providing secure employment opportunities for the majority of food chain workers. The second motivation was the fact that while many food system stakeholders have been taking actions to improve the sustainability of food systems, their many initiatives have tended to be independent of one another and don't recognize the complex trade-offs that are intrinsic to food systems. So we see the summit as providing a potentially transformative moment that can be used to help stakeholders generate the coordinated solutions that are needed for food systems to play out their role. The summit therefore sets out to achieve 4 main outcomes. Firstly, dramatically elevating public discourse on the importance of food systems for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Secondly, and this is a key role of the action tracks, to identify significant solutions that enable the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. Thirdly, establishing a set of principles that will serve to leverage food system capacities. And importantly, fourthly, a system of follow-up and review. So we've put in place an intensive preparatory process, which will include a pre-summit event in Rome that will probably take place next July, and we'll run through to the summit in New York next September. And it will also prepare the basis for post-summit action. This process recognizes that only with the participation of all food system constituencies will we achieve the necessary buy-in and coordination of action. It needs to be not just about a solutions summit, but a people's summit. There are 2 main components of the process that will allow for this active engagement of all stakeholder groups. These are the action tracks and the Food Systems Summit dialogues. 5 action tracks have been tasked with developing game-changing solutions, and these are structured around the summit objectives. Firstly, ensuring access to safe and nutritious food for all. This is the task of action track 1. Secondly, shifting to sustainable consumption patterns. A third action track on boosting nature positive production. A fourth on improving livelihoods, and a fifth on increasing resilience to food systems. The 5 action tracks, which you'll hear a lot more about in today's session, will run in concert with an extensive program of Food System Summit dialogues. The dialogues will be of 3 types. Firstly, dialogues which take place within global events that have a significant food systems component. For example, global conferences on sustainable food systems of various types. A second type of dialogue is the member state-led dialogue. The aspiration is to have a series of 3 dialogues in every country globally, providing the opportunity for stakeholders to feed their ideas into the summit process. And we will also have independent dialogues, which allow any constituency or community to hold dialogues, and again, providing they follow a set of principles to feed the outcomes of their dialogues into the process. And we hope that together, taken together with the action tracks, these food system dialogues will provide both the opportunity to elevate ideas from the national and subnational levels up to the action track discussions, but will also provide a basis for ground testing emerging solutions which are being generated by the action tracks themselves. Taken together with an inclusive set of support structures, we have a champions network, which Tom has referred to. There's a scientific group to ensure the independence of evidence which is underpinning the discussions, and also a UN task force to draw in the skills and capacities of the United Nations entities. So taken together, our aspiration that this process will really generate a summit that sets in train truly game-changing solutions which are urgently needed to transform our food systems. Thank you, Tom.
Jamie, thank you very much for a very clear setting of the scene and the wider context that this is part of a process of just enhancing the quality of dialogue about food systems around the world. So everyone on the call today is an important part of that. The next part of our program is a video from Janya Green, who is the Youth Vice-Chair of Action Track 1. And Janya, we look forward to viewing the video.
Hi, I'm Jania Green, a 17-year-old 4-H member from Georgia in the United States, and I'm one of the vice chairs for Action Track 1. I am honored to be working with such incredible leaders from all across the world who are committed to working together to finding game-changing solutions for some of the world's most difficult problems. The Food System Summit is extremely important to me. All across the world, people are hungry and in need, and we must step up to address the hunger gap to provide nutritious and safe foods for all. In my own community, I've seen the high rates of obesity and other nutrition-related diseases that have affected our population. That's why I helped launch the Village Community Garden, a 2-hectare garden that provides free, fresh fruits and vegetables to community members in need. I hope that by getting involved in the Food System Summit through Action Track 1, I can further my personal commitment to addressing food security by working to address nutritional concerns worldwide. Through this work, I hope to inspire young people to step up and take interest in this important topic. I've been working for the last several years to help my peers understand how vital it is to provide safe and nutritious foods to our community. In this pandemic, I've seen youth take responsibility to begin their own gardens to provide for themselves and their families. And I would personally love to see young people across the globe stepping up to cultivate community gardens of their own to provide nutritious foods for their fellow citizens. In the meantime, I'm honored to be a voice at the table to encourage more young people to get involved and make a difference. As we all raise our voices and reach out to our own networks, together we can inspire change.
Jania, that was great. I know you can't be with us in person because you're at school today. And I know that many of us on this call will have been watching very carefully what's been happening in Georgia in recent weeks. So we feel a great connection with you. So Jania, thank you very much indeed. And that was great. Now we're going to move on to an overview of Action Track 1's work. And it's going to be delivered by Godfrey Bahiigwa. And Godfrey is the Vice Chair of Action Track 1. And he's also the Director of Rural Economy and Agriculture in the African Union Commission. Godfrey, over to you. Godfrey, we can't hear you yet.
Thank you so much, Chair.
Very good.
As introduced, I work with the African Union Commission, and I'm the Vice Chair to Lawrence Haddad for Action Track number 1. Welcome to this forum. To guide our discussion today, we have prepared a couple of slides focusing on what the challenges are, what the opportunities are, and what we need to do and how we shall do it. Starting with the challenge, we have a couple of slides on key indicators that characterize the challenges towards ensuring access to safe and nutritious food for all. First, hunger was projected to rise before the onset of COVID-19, both in absolute numbers and in percentage terms. The number of undernourished people in the world was projected to rise from 688 million in 2019 to 841 by 2030. The onset of COVID-19 has, in just 9 months, reversed the gains that were achieved in the last decade. The number of wasted children under the age of 5 rose from 47 million to 54 million in just 9 months, which was the level that it was 10 years earlier in 2010. Third, about 40% of the world population cannot afford a healthy diet. And as you can see on the screen, the situation is most pronounced in Africa, where almost 3 out of 4 people cannot afford a healthy meal. This is a very big concern. Fourth, obesity is rising everywhere in the world, as you can see on the screen, and it is rising at accelerating rates, and this presents numerous health challenges. So what opportunity do we have to address these challenges? The work of Action Track number 1, which as was introduced earlier, is about ensuring access to safe and nutritious food for all. We would like to identify a set of systemic and game-changing solutions leading to zero hunger, access to nutritious food, and safe food for all by 2030. What are we expected to do? In other words, what are our terms of reference? As you may be aware, there are 5 action tracks, and ours is one of them. Each action track is expected to scan or identify game-changing solutions that are evidence-based, aligned with each other, set out expected impacts and explain how they generate co-benefits, provide 2 to 3 points to inform a voluntary political outcome, engage with pace setter countries, communities, companies, or coalitions to advance the action and commitment by the time of the summit in September next year. And also look beyond the summit towards implementation and develop an accountability mechanism to track and report on progress that is being made. How will the action tracks work? Each action track has a defined leadership program, and Yemi mentioned some of these elements, so I will not spend too much time on this. But just to say that at the center is the leadership team of about 30 people. As part of the leadership team is a core team of about 10 people that serve as the secretariat of the leadership team. To obtain or identify the game-changing solutions, various platforms and discussion groups will be organized to generate or identify the game-changing ideas. And in this case, the role of the leadership team will be to advise the core team on the ideas from the various platforms and discussion groups. What is our goal? Our goal is to develop exemplary, aligned, game-changing and systemic solutions under this action track for presentation at the summit in September. The process of developing these systemic and game-changing solutions will include engaging widely to collect different ideas, including open fora like this. Once that is done, the second will be going through or sifting, prioritizing, and further developing these ideas to make them feasible for implementation. And three, securing commitment for these game changers. And therefore, we shall be looking for complementary commitments that support game-changing solutions from governments, from the private sector, from development agencies, and from civil society. And ultimately, when all this is done, we aim to identify these game-changing solutions that will ensure access to safe food and nutritious food for all by 2030. I thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Godfrey, thank you very much again. A very clear presentation, and I thank you for it. We are now moving on to the next stage of this forum, and it's going to involve 3 presentations from experts, each of whom are members of the leadership team of Action Track 1, Corina Hawkes, Jess Fanzo, and Maureen Muketa. And we're going to go firstly to Corina, and after Corina's presentation, we will have space for discussion. Corina is the director of the Centre for Food Policy in the City of the University of London, and she is a recognised expert in this field. Corina, we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much, Tom, and it's delightful to be here and wonderful to be engaging in this important action track as the group, as the chair of the subgroup on nutritious foods. But my role today is to set out the areas of focus of the action track, the specific areas of focus. And the work, obviously, overarching work is around access to nutritious foods and affordability of nutritious foods, but there was safe and nutritious foods. But there's 3 elements, and we've divided the work into 3 thematic pillars. The first is zero hunger, the second is access to nutritious foods, and the third is food safety. And many of you, all of you on this participating in this today will be aware of the importance of those 3 different elements. Clearly, zero hunger is vital to address, and unfortunately, because of COVID-19, hunger, specifically wasting among children, is predicted to increase. The latest predictions were that it would increase by 14%, but it may be well worse than that. So it's imperative to deal with the zero hunger question. Secondly, access to nutritious foods. The State of Food Insecurity report, State of Food and Nutrition Insecurity report that came out from the FAO recently showed that more than 3 billion people cannot afford a healthy diet, and that a healthy meal costs 5 times more as a starch-based meal. So clearly making sure that people have access to those foods, economic and physical access, is vital. And thirdly, food safety. We know that there are 600 million cases of foodborne related illnesses annually, with a lot of these among children under the age of 5. So these are the 3 themes for the action track that we have defined so far. And each of these pillars has co-leads and working group members, and we've been brought together to advance the thinking and identify the systemic game-changing solutions for each of these areas, and importantly, understanding how they interact with the other action tracks, which are on different issues such as livelihoods, nature-friendly production, and with resilience as well. So we've really just started the work. That each of these different themes are currently planning the approaches that we're going to take. And I'd like to, in the last minute and a half that I have available, just give an example about what that looks like for the nutritious foods subgroup, which I am chairing. So the purpose of the nutritious foods subgroup will be to identify how these systemic game-changing solutions can be delivered to address the challenge of lack of affordability. There is a clear need to really engage with this issue of affordability. So we'll be focused on that, and we'll be focused on a vision of influencing and changing the lives of those 3 billion people who can't afford a healthy diet, and understanding how we can make these game-changing solutions to ensure they can eat more safe, nutritious foods, whole grain staples, legumes, nuts, fruits, vegetables, etc., and how we can try and move off the plate the refined, starchy and nutrient poor foods, often high in fat, sugar and salt. So we will be looking at all of the diet. And if we're thinking about trying to identify systemic solutions, how can we do that? We have to put affordability in context, in the context of systems. So that means that when we're looking at game-changing solutions on food prices, we won't just be saying, well, let's subsidize food or let's tax, important though those policy options might be, but we'll be saying, what are the fundamental things in the food system that really influence the price of food, that really go way back into the food system? They're huge, really big levers, and looking at those levers and in the context of all those other food systems issues, such as environment and livelihoods, so we can try and find solutions that have co-benefits across the system. But affordability isn't just a matter, if we're going to put affordability in a systems context, we have to remember that we're trying to affect people's lives here. And that will mean understanding how much money people have. Poverty is an important part of this, and that links across again to other action tracks. And it also means understanding the realities of people's lives, which influence how they value and perceive food and how much they are willing to pay for it. For example, if somebody has nowhere to prepare food, even if they might value buying vegetables, they're not going to do it because they've got nowhere to prepare it, which immediately means that something has to be extremely inexpensive before it becomes a matter of that family valuing that product. And it can be vice versa for snack foods, for example. A mother in a real life may want to show their child love, but have very little money to do that. And therefore a packet of snacks makes up for that, even though they may be relatively more expensive than the more nutritious foods. So we have to understand affordability in the context of people's real lives and the context of these huge, big upstream food systems issues. So by doing that and by cross-cutting with gender, financing, innovation, and young people's agency, which are the cross-cutting themes for all of the action tracks, we believe that we'll be able to identify solutions which really are really systemic, really bold, and really ambitious. And my final point, I need to come to a close now. My final point is that we know there's so many solutions out there already. The problem is in implementation. So in identifying these systemic solutions, what we'll be doing is identifying what is actually stopping and what needs to happen to enable these solutions to be implemented. And so some of our systemic game-changing solutions may be about overcoming barriers to implementation rather than quite a technically focused action. So I hope I've managed to describe there what we mean in our bold ambition, the ambition that we have for bold ideas and game-changing solutions, which move on from the standard way of approaching it. So what we want to know from you is, have we got our focus right in focusing on these three key aspects: reducing hunger, making nutritious foods more affordable, and making food safer? And is our approach to try and bring really big picture thinking, understanding these issues in the context in which they play out in the reality of people's lives and the food system more broadly, have we got that right? Over to you, Tom.
Karina, thank you very much. You've kept very much to time. That's really excellent. And you bring to this discussion, of course, a great sense of practicality, mentioning that all of these discussions have to be made in the context of understanding people's lives, because there are factors there which are going to determine people's choices. So we're going to move directly now to questions that are coming in, and I'm cooperating with Stella in identifying what questions are coming on the table. And the first one comes from Jose Luis Vivero, to ask the question: why are we not proposing a different narrative? Food as a human right, public good and commons. And Karina, would you like to address that? And maybe just immediately afterwards, perhaps Jess could intervene on that one as well.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think what we are proposing here is to try and alter the narrative. Jose, you suggest a particular narrative around food as commons. The narrative I think we're trying to take forward is that of putting these issues in the context of the way that the whole food system functions and the context of actually having impact on the ground. So I don't think we're adopting a very particular named philosophical approach to this. We're wanting to take into account the different narratives that are out there, but to push forward an overarching narrative that we have to actually get this action done on the ground in a way that works for people. And perhaps the philosophical narratives will follow on behind that. But Jess, you may have some specific comments on that particular narrative.
I think, thanks, Corinna, and thanks for such a great overview of our task that the action track has to do. I think, Jose, you bring up a really great point of ensuring maybe we can move away from the idea of narrative to that, any of these game changers, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, and the actions that we take forward should always have that rights-based approach, the right to food, and really ensuring an equity lens is taken across the entire UN Food Summit, and that's being called upon by all the action tracks. So if we take an equity approach, we should absolutely take a right to food approach. So I think your comment is one that resonates well, and we can continue to talk about it when we think about solutions and who pulls the levers on those solutions. But your point on rights should be the backbone of the entire UN Food Summit, and I believe there are calls to ensure that is so.
But I think the critical factor is, while one takes a particular philosophical approach, there has to be a very pragmatic sense that there are particular policy measures which are are relevant to working towards the achievement of that approach. I think we have to keep the focus both on the philosophical basis, but on the pragmatic policy that is most effective. So thank you both for those comments. Could I now move on to a question from T or Thai BL? Will there be any efforts to curb intake of hyper palatable, ultra processed foods, since they are often affordable, compete with nutritious foods, and can facilitate overconsumption, obesity, and diet-related non-communicable diseases? I think that is a really important question, and it's directed to you, Karina.
Yeah, so our ambition is to see that the 3 billion people are eating more safe, nutritious foods and less refined, starchy foods and the highly palatable foods to which Thai refers, which are nutrient poor, often energy dense, often high in fat, sugars and salt. So the idea is to focus on both in complement to each other. What we've seen in the past is often there'll be one group of people thinking about increasing access to the nutritious foods and another group of people talking about reducing affordability and reducing the appeal of highly palatable foods high in fat, sugars and salt with very little nutritional value. We will be looking at both because we recognize that one of the reasons why nutritious foods often get crowded off the plate is because of the appeal and affordability of the less desirable and less nutritious foods. But as I said earlier, we need to understand the context in which people are making the options that people are faced with and the decisions that people are making about those foods together. And that'll just be one of the several things that we're doing, which makes our work a little bit different to what's come before us. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Karina. Let's move on now to a question from Pat McMahon, who says, last week, Francesco Branca of the World Health Organization said that nutrition-specific interventions would not be part of the Food Systems Summit. The game changer might be scaling up nutrition-specific interventions to those in immediate need, while nutrition sensitivity takes time to find longer-term solutions. He would appreciate any thoughts of that, and that again directed at Karina, but also to perhaps after Karina, perhaps Sheryl Hendriks would like to comment as well. So Karina.
Thanks for that. Yes, this is an important point about the role of nutrition specific and nutrition sensitive actions. And I would say that I think since we're looking at long-term issues, that areas that are often termed nutrition sensitive, in other words, other sectors becoming more sensitive to nutritional concerns, are always going to be really important to us. But I will pass to Sheryl to speak more specifically to that question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. At this stage, there's no limit to what solutions we're looking at. So we're wanting to find out from this kind of dialogue, what are the top priorities that we should be focusing on. And so sometimes, well, very often a complementary approach is very important. And so, no, we certainly haven't swept nutrition sensitive and nutrition specific solutions off the table. So bright ideas of what works and why it works is what we're really interested in understanding, because so often we know in theory what should work, but in practice, they don't always roll out the expectations that we have. So we would love to hear from you more on the topic.
Okay, thank you, Sheryl. Could I just say that Sheryl is the head of department and professor of food security in the Department of Agricultural Economics in University of Pretoria, and is really a very important spokesperson for, or at least contributor to, many of the debates within Africa, which is such an important part of our debate on food systems. I'd now like to move on to a question from Eugene Clerk. Eugene says the Eat Lancet report from 2019 argued for a change towards a plant-based diet in order to keep food production sustainable and help achieve long-term climate change target. Can you explain what the limitations are that might limit the ability for a wholesale move to a plant-based diet? And that question is directed to Jess.
Thanks for the question. I think, you know, the Eat Lancet set out a bold global agenda. The complexities get into local context, national priorities of how to move towards a more sustainable food system for healthy diets. So I think the challenges that some countries face is the cost of doing that. Challenges can be traditions, social norms, food traditions of some cultures. Challenges can be trade-offs of ensuring that countries continue to grow economically and stay within planetary boundaries, but also meet human health needs. So there's many trade-offs to get towards that grand transformation. And countries will have to deal with those trade-offs, particularly countries that are dealing with a low or minimal resources to be able to make that grand transformation. So the Eat Lancet set out a bold agenda, but it did miss some things. And that's for the next commission report, particularly the economic implications, not only the cost to do the transformation or make that kind of transformation, but the cost in doing that transformation. What are some of the systemic trade-offs that would happen with that transformation? And who wins and who loses in that transformation? They're real questions.
Yeah.
So yeah, I hope that's sufficient.
I think it is. I think that's very good. But it connects to another set of two questions, if you like, which have come in from Christina Chauvenet and Tai Bial. And I'm going to put them together. And I would like, again, perhaps, Jess, you might wish to comment, and then perhaps Karina as well. Where does sustainability and the Eat Lancet framework fit into this track? If considering environmental impact, how will this action track be influenced by other action tracks? For example, animal source foods have high nutrient density, but are typically considered to have high environmental impacts. How will nutrition and health be balanced with environmental impacts? Which will be the priority where there are inevitable trade-offs? That seems to me to put in a very clear way some of the real challenges and in relation to trade-offs that the action track and the wider set of action tracks will have to confront. So Jess, would you like to start on that?
Yeah, and I'd love for anyone else to come in on this. This was a debate following the publication of the Eat Lancet of the conundrum of animal source foods. And to me, again, it comes down to an equity issue. There's some countries that will need to make much bigger changes in moving towards healthy and sustainable diets than others. You know, so when we look at environmental footprints, health footprints on portions of the population, we have to look at it from an equity lens. Again, some countries, some individuals, some communities will need to make more significant changes to move towards more environmental sustainability. But in the context of this action track, environment will be included, and Karina can talk a bit more about that, but we're working very closely with Action Track 2 and Action Track 3 that will be addressing some of the sustainability and environmental issues of food systems. And maybe Lawrence also wants to come in on that.
Yeah, I would like Lawrence to comment as well, please. So Karina first.
Well, I'll just be very brief and say that when we're talking about nutritious foods, that animal source foods are nutritious foods, and so they will be included. and that clearly the need and demand for nutritious food, for animal source foods from a nutritional perspective, is that very, very modest, very small amounts are required in the diet. So that's important. Eggs and other things, for example, related foods, fish as well, for example. But that when it comes to very high levels of consumption of meat, then this is clearly problematic from a health perspective as well as an environmental perspective. And so there's a clear synergy there with that action track on sustainability.
Lawrence, would you like to comment?
Sure, thank you. And hi, everybody. Thank you so much for participating in this open forum, and thank you for the great questions. And Tom, I've been typing in some answers to some questions as well. On this one in particular, it's a tricky issue. Food systems are complex and they defy easy answers, and sort of moving to a plant-based diet is kind of an easy answer when you think about things in the aggregate. But of course, people don't live in the aggregate, they live in very specific contexts. And so any solutions that we generate have to be context specific and culture specific. And there are some people that eat way too much meat, and their food-based dietary guidelines in their countries suggest they should eat less. And there are some groups of vulnerable people who are vulnerable to malnutrition who are eating too little. And UNICEF is very clear on its recommendation for small amounts of animal source foods to be consumed by young children who are vulnerable to malnutrition. But one final thing I would say is that if any of you haven't read the latest Global Panel Foresight 2.0 report, I really recommend you read it, because it just shows you how complex the trade-offs are. We like to think of animal source foods and greenhouse gas emissions as one of the trade-offs. Or maybe one area of strong alignment between greenhouse gas emission and improved health. But once you start getting into other dimensions of environmental quality and environmental degradation, the picture becomes very murky very quickly. And so animal source foods are the biggest culprit for greenhouse gas emissions. But when it comes to water use, energy use, nitrogen cycles, phosphorus cycles, and land use, it's a much more complicated picture. Over.
Thank you, Lawrence. I'm glad you mentioned the Global Panel's report, because I know that Patrick Webb, who is the principal author of the panel's report, is on this call, and I would absolutely recommend the reference to the panel's report. I think it's a source of great insight. So anyone interested in this topic should definitely refer to that. We've probably time for one or two more questions in this session, and the first one is from Parag Namdeo, who says, transforming food systems is crucial for delivering all the Sustainable Development Goals. We are concerned about inclusion of persons with disability in this narrative, specifically the most marginalized, i.e. children with deaf blindness and multiple disabilities. Are they getting enough? Are they getting represented enough in ongoing discussions to deliver the sustainable goals, as their need for nutrition is critical? This is, again, an important, very important question. Lawrence, are you best placed to answer? Who was that?
Sure, Tom. I mean, the honest answer, Parag, is they haven't been involved enough, I don't think, so far. So whatever you can do to help us, put us into touch with the right people and the right networks, be most appreciated. Please do put a link, or anyone else on the call, if there are key groups that we need to be talking to. I mean, Corinna's right, we just started. So yeah. If there are key groups you can connect us to, please do. Over.
I mean, this is the value of a forum like this. Issues can be raised and connections can be made and followed up. So let's proceed on that basis. Thanks for that, Lawrence. I have a question from Hugh Bagnall Oakley, who says, nutritious foods relate to the spectrum of agricultural enterprises, crops, livestock, fish, and tree crops. Many countries have a very poor agricultural base. How is this to be expanded in a sustainable and long-term way? And he's asked that this question be directed to Godfrey. And again, I think it's particularly appropriate because the important work that the African Union Commission are doing along these lines. So Godfrey, would you like to venture a response to Hugh's question?
I'm no expert in this field, but let me say what it is that we at the African Union Commission are trying to do to address this matter. concerned about the high malnutrition on the continent, and especially among children less than 5 years old. One of the key items on our agenda is to promote nutrient-dense foods, especially through biofortification. Biofortification is a big agenda for the African Union to try to improve nutrition outcomes on the continent. And what are we talking about? We are talking about improved beans, sweet potatoes, high protein maize, and so on. That is high on the agenda for the continent. While I still have the floor, let me also make a comment on an earlier question about promoting plant-based nutrition. On the continent, the belief, at least at the African Union, is for the next foreseeable future, the continent's young children will be feeding on animal-based foods, because they are the easier ones to address the nutrition deficits that are on the continent. So as much as the Lancet has that bold agenda, we believe that for the next foreseeable future, consumption of protein-based foods will be high on the continent. And thirdly, we also observe globally that as people's incomes rise from low income to middle income categories, consumption of animal products just becomes a natural progression in people's diets. And so as the African continent is equally transforming, and we have increasing segment in the middle income category, we'll see increased consumption of animal products. That is an hazard to answer. Thank you.
Godfrey, thank you very much indeed. Okay, we've a lot of great questions. We're not going to be able to answer them all, but they can be answered. Questions that are put that can't be answered in this formal session online can be answered afterwards, and that's the intention. But we've one final question in this particular discussion segment, and it's from Marcos Lopez. How can decent employment, income, and social protection be better addressed by the summit as key pillars to make nutritious food more affordable? And that question is directed towards Karina, please.
Thank you for that question. It's really vital. And certainly in terms of when we're talking about access to nutritious foods, we're thinking about three different elements. We're thinking about the price of that food, the income and poverty level of people who are purchasers of that food, who acquire that food. And thirdly, as I mentioned earlier, the perceptions of value and affordability, which play such an important role alongside price and influencing what people are buying. And you refer to the middle one, the issue about income and the role of social protection, social safety nets, and other issues around how to address poverty more effectively. That will be really important from a livelihoods perspective, which is the subject of another action track, as well as the hunger subgroup of the work that we're doing. And certainly it'll be an important part of access to nutritious foods. And so we're trying to see it from price, people, and the context of those people's lives. And that means that the income and social protection will be a really crucial part of the work that we are doing. And I think as the work on the Food Systems Summit evolves, that we will work really hard to keep the inequality focus of the summit and understanding that it's inequalities and the need to address those inequalities, which is also vital in order to have food systems that can actually serve the people in those contexts.
Okay, Karina, thank you. That, I think, brings to a close this particular segment of our program. I think we're doing really well on time. We're meeting all our objectives thus far. And we are now going to move on directly to Jess Fanzo. Jess is the Bloomberg Distinguished Professor of Global Food and Agricultural Policy and Ethics at Johns Hopkins University. And she's been a vital part of the debate on this whole debate around food for as long as I know her, which is about 25 years. Jess, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Tom. And thanks to Lawrence and Godfrey for inviting me to be a part of this fantastic session. It's so great to see so many people online from all over the world. It's really cool. Thank you all so much for tuning in. I'm going to share my slides. Okay, so I'm been asked to talk about the game-changing solutions. So the UN Summit has asked for all of us to define exemplary, aligned, game-changing, and systemic solutions. So I'm going to talk about what these game-changing solutions are, define them, and throw out some criteria that we can discuss. But what's the game we're trying to change? Well, for Action Track 1, it's what Corinna had outlined: reducing hunger, ensuring nutritious food is available, affordable, accessible, and making sure that foods are safe to eat. So what is game changing? And what is systemic? What would a solution look like that look like? So when you think about game changing, you think about words like disrupt, catalyst, macro, transformative. When you think of systemic, you think about holistic, changing the whole system rather than just a part of it. And so thanks to Stella, who's on the call from GAIN, she put together a fantastic note about game-changing and systemic solutions. So what's been proposed is that these solutions are feasible actions. They're based on evidence and best practice. They would shift the norm. They'd shift operational models, rules, incentives, and structures. They would act on multiple parts of the system or have ramifications throughout the entire system to advance goals. And of course, these game-changing and systemic solutions should be sustainable over time. So a paper that will be coming out, I think next week, by Chris Barrett and colleagues, a few of us, including some, Mario Herrero, who's on the science group of the summit, and others were involved with coming up with some of these game changers, what we called socio-technical bundles of innovation. But when it comes time to thinking about what those game changers are, it's not just a technology or an innovation or a policy or an intervention. To become a game changer, it takes a lot more than that. It takes not only the enabling environment, it takes trust, it takes finance, it takes responsibility, it takes acceptance, it takes thinking about how these game changers would be implemented, how they would be scaled, and what are some of the drivers that would influence those game changers. So we would love to hear from all of you about how you perceive game changers and systemic solutions when we're starting to think about what those solutions would actually be. And here's some criteria for you to consider. So the first bullet I put is that these game changers have to ensure equity. We have to, to me, that's the overarching issue. We have to move towards more equity in the food system. We need to focus on young people. We need to focus on marginalized populations and disabled populations. Those have been some comments from those of you who've joined us today. We're at a time right now where many people are being left behind. People are being purposefully left behind. We need to give voice and agency to those populations and ensure that they're sitting at the decision-making table around these solutions. We need to have a departure from existing practices. We need to shake up the system here. We need to revolutionize the system and think of things that will really shape us moving into the second half of the 21st century. We need to address long-term constraints or obstacles. Be thinking about more than just your area that you focus on food systems, but entire food systems that could be implemented at scale, meaning reaching lots of the population. Needs to be feasible. You know, governments are under incredible stress, resource constraints, human capacity constraints. So what's feasible for governments? What's feasible for communities? What's feasible for individuals? We need to be sustainable in the medium and long term, thinking about impacts to 2030, but beyond. And we have to be thinking about trade-offs, ensuring we do no harm, ensuring that we don't have negative impacts on other action track goals. And of course, some of the game changers need to be empirically verifiable. So here's some criteria when we start thinking about these solutions that Sheryl has called for all of you to start thinking about. So I think I'll leave it there, Tom, and I'll leave up this discussion if you want to open it up to the group that's joined us today.
Yeah, great. Okay, thanks, Jess. I think you've set it out very clearly there. And indeed, we have already a couple of questions coming in. And here I would, in terms of just how we're funneling these questions, I'd like to acknowledge Stella Nordhagen, who's been helping me to select the questions and help me pose the questions. So Stella, you're doing a great job so far, so keep it up. The question is, first question is from Dan Irvin, who says, one dimension of our food systems challenges that I am not hearing thus far coming significantly into our dialogue is the issue of urbanization. How significant is the trend of urban growth in our analysis, and what kind of considerations do we need to make there? And also a similar question from Sylvia Fisher, your thought on the role of urban food systems in achieving the action track. And the person to whom these questions are addressed is Sheryl, and of course it's particularly relevant given the trends in urbanization on the continent of Africa. So Sheryl, could you respond, please?
Yes, thank you so much. So my role here is to represent the science group of this action track. And this is one consideration that we took very seriously, not just the rate of urbanization, but also population growth and the multiple impacts that has on food safety, nutrition, and equity issues. And so we recognize that very much context matters. And so many of my colleagues have already referred to income and to affordability. And the urban context is quite unique in many ways. Sometimes people lack access to safe water and sanitation. There are issues of access, food environments, and what is actually available in the environment. So these are certainly factors that we think are crucial and that all the action tracks are considering in the final analysis of these solutions. So yes, they certainly are not neglected, and we recognize that urban systems have their uniqueness that we also need to consider. But when you're considering the food system as a whole, the interlinkages between urban and rural can't be ignored. So it's very, very important that we think about the system as a whole, not a system in distinct parts, but recognizing the contextual issues related to each environment. Thank you, Tom.
Thanks indeed, Sheryl. Okay, next question is from Courtney Scott. Says, affordability in the context of systems and people's realities is absolutely key. Linking to production system could help unlock some of the sticking points. What type of solutions might work across both affordability of nutritious food and nature-friendly production? And Courtney has asked that perhaps Jess would address this question.
Yeah, I didn't hear it all. Sorry, Tom. Sorry about that. I didn't hear the exact question.
Well,
I can come in.
Yeah, Karina, yeah, please.
Sure. Thanks for that question. Yeah. So an example of a big upstream change that could help with that could be changing the way that money is spent in the system. So we know that absolutely billions of money is spent in the food system every year. And we know there's an increased amount of private sector investment and private funds in the food system. We know there are huge subsidies, public and other types of public sector funding. And we know that there's different types of investments that are made into agricultural research. So when we start to look at how some of the resources in the food system are allocated, we can start to map out how this affects the cost of food on people's that people have access to, but also how it incentivizes certain production techniques. So I think that's an example of how, when we start to have a look at some of the really big issues that are driving the food system, that we can start to think about how it affects what's on people's plates, but also the type of systems which are used to produce food, which affects environmental sustainability. That would be one example.
Okay, thanks, Corinna. Let's move on then to a question from Sharon Bly. Can we walk the talk with our own people and drive systemic change through the workforce? 58% of the global population spend at least 1/3 of their adult lives at work. Can we support their nutrition through workforce nutrition approaches to address access, such as access to food, education, health checks, and breastfeeding support for potentially millions of workers, the most vulnerable of whom may be facing hunger? And that question is addressed very appropriately to Lawrence, because I know that GAIN has been doing some really important work in this area. Lawrence.
Yeah, I mean, I probably have a bit of a conflict of interest in answering this question, Tom, because I'm a big believer in this whole area, and it's not just businesses; it's every employer. You know, I think it's between 1 and 2 billion people are in regular employment, and it's an environment they spend 8 to 10 hours of their lives in every day. So that environment needs to support good nutrition, whether that is exclusive breastfeeding, affordable nutritious food, nutrition education, safe food, safe sanitation and safe water, you name it. All of those things need to be provided by employers. And it's often the very large employers, especially in the private sector, who have the capacity to do that. And they have the incentive to do that, because the benefit cost ratios are at least 3 to 1. Every dollar spent on improving workforce nutrition programs generates at least $3 back in terms of more productive, more loyal, more motivated, higher well-being staff, less turnover, less absenteeism. So it's really a question for companies it's really a question for this action track to think, why is that not happening? Why is it just a few companies that are doing this? Why isn't this the default? Why is it that the companies have to sort of almost opt into doing this? It should be the case that they have to opt out of it. So I think we'll be looking really hard at that. And Sharon, any insights you can give us on what we can do to make this easier and more attractive for private sector to do, but also the public sector as well, would be really welcome. Thank you.
All right, and I just refer
Can I
to...
add one comment?
Yeah, sure, Jess.
I think we're still dealing with many people, particularly who work in the food system, that are undocumented and unrecognized by any company. They don't have any rights. They don't get any benefits. We see this in the United States, one of the wealthiest countries in the world. There are so many undocumented workers working to grow our food that get zero support, or are fearful for being deported. So I think and this is all over the world. You go to Italy, it's the same thing. A lot of Africans are working in southern Italy, growing lots of the horticulture that we enjoy every day. So I think we need to also be thinking about, how do we support those workers who spend 12, 13, 14, 15 hours in fields, won't get any support from the quote companies that they work for. How do we support them? Civil society becomes really important. NGOs become important. Governments become important if they recognize them with social protection and safety nets. So I think Lawrence brings up a really great point of improving the mandates of companies, but there's many companies that don't even recognize their own workers, and a lot of that is in the food system. So just a thought for the overall group.
And I mean, just to connect both of your comments there and to connect it with a question, which I'm not proposing to be further answered because I think it's partly been answered already. Question from Caroline Smith Deval, who had made the comment that how can we engage food workers in identifying the hurdles and steps needed to improve access to safe, nutritious, affordable foods. I'd like to move on to a question from Tom van Moorik, who says it would be good for people to start thinking about solutions if we could give an example of a clear game-changing solution. While I'm all for community, rural and urban gardens, would that be a game-changing solution? I'm minded to note here that the great work that Helen Keller International has done in this whole area of community gardens over many years. Jess, well, maybe let me ask Godfrey, give Jess a little rest for the moment. Godfrey, would you like to respond to that question?
Sorry, Tom, could you repeat the question, please?
Okay, if it will be good for people to start thinking about solutions, if we could give an example of a clear game-changing solution. While I'm all for community, rural and urban gardens, would that be a game-changing solution? Does that issue of promoting community gardens feature in the vision of the African Union Commission?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, looking at this particular question, I think Jessica just presented some initial thoughts about the criteria that we shall use for identifying these game-changing solutions. And I think in the coming weeks, these criteria will be debated and discussed and agreed upon, and then examples can start coming out that then would guide people to think about game-changing solutions. So that's one point. Second point about African Union's thinking about nutrition in our rural communities. There are different thoughts. First of all, there are two aspects. One related to education, that if we want to improve nutrition on the continent, we need to educate our households, our families, on how to feed better. So you do have lots of families with access to food, but that food does not have variety in its content. And so the call for us as African Union is to increase education on how to diversify the diet of the rural communities. That's one. The second aspect is encouraging households to have what you can call, for lack of a better term, vegetable gardens or household gardens that are beyond the typical staple food crops that are consumed on a regular basis. But again, it is in the same context of diversifying the diet through education. Over.
Okay. Can I come in?
Yeah, of course, Sheryl.
Yeah, thanks. We need to remember, though, that design matters and context matters. So we can identify community gardens as a potential solution, but the design of those programs, whether it be social protection or whether it be community gardens, really does determine the impact. And unless it considers the context and the local environment, they can have either positive or negative outcomes. So design is critical. So saying something as a blanket yes is a little tricky.
Yeah, I think absolutely. I mean, that comment I think probably applies in so just every area. You have to take the realities, the local realities into account. I'd like to move then to a question from Olive Towie Jangal. How can we build positively on the changes which came about as a result of COVID, recognizing norms and behavior can be changed if the risks are clear? Can we tap into behavioral research which may be underway, looking at social policy and political change that's happened throughout 2020? I think that's an important question, and it's directed to Corina.
So the point that's being sorry, I was just answering another. I got the first half, and I was just answering another question. Can you just repeat the second half of what was being asked?
Yeah, the second half is actually indeed pertinent. Can we tap into any behavioral research which may be underway, looking at social, political policy and political change that has happened through 2020? In other words, a lot of us have really been changed more rapidly in many areas than we anticipated we ever could as a result of COVID, and other things relative to food systems here that this is relevant for.
Absolutely. So if we look at the impact of COVID-19 on people's eating practices, there's enormous variations around the world, but there are some pretty consistent patterns emerging around that, both in terms of the way that food is being consumed and what is being consumed. And that does vary between low and high income groups. But what we are, there's also changes in food systems and the availability of foods, again, very context specific, with a multiplicity of changes that have happened that are actually rather more difficult to generalize about than people's changes in people's eating habits. So there's some really rich information emerging from what is obviously a rather tragic situation we're living in right now. And one of the key learnings, there are quite a few key things we can take from that, and I'd just like to really mention a couple. And the first is that what we have seen, particularly in the more difficult situations of constrictions, is that people have changed the way that they are eating, and that the forms of systems of provision of that food have also changed in ways that people said, oh, that can't happen, that will never happen. So it's what COVID has shown, despite all the problems with it, is that possibility of change. People say it's not possible. It is possible. It is possible. And some of the changes that we've seen as a result of COVID show that. But the second, one of the second lessons of what's happened is that when it comes to behaviors, is that there needs to be planning in the food system. That in the past, we've said the food system, people behave in the way that they do, and the food system behaves in the way that it does. And it's the market, just the market. It's not. There's so many different factors that go into people's behaviors in the food system and in terms of their eating behaviors. And that what we've seen in COVID is that careful planning makes a difference, makes a very, very positive difference by businesses, by governments, and by families. So what I take away from COVID-19 is that behaviors can change both by food systems actors and by people.
And Corina, could I just follow up on that? Because it's not just people that are perhaps changing behaviors. I mean, governments have had to look at looking at their social protection systems in the context of COVID. What evidence is there that we've got some positive movement on the part of government to think more creatively about what needs to be done in social protection?
So I think there's been over 600, according to the World Bank, there's been over 600 new types of schemes brought in by governments around social protection. And the large majority of those are around food. And so again, this shows that when then there is a need, and there has been a need since way before COVID, that governments will act and can be innovative in the types of solutions that they're taking. I mean, there's lots of government actions, from distributing free seeds so people can develop to home gardens, all the way to just increasing the amount of payments made out through social protection schemes. So there's been lots of different changes that have happened. Again, another indicator that it is possible to change behavior. There's also been enormous fiscal investment, trillions and trillions of dollars, according to the IMF. My question would be, and I think it's a question we need to think of carefully in this action track, is how much of that trillions of dollars that have gone into fiscal stimulus packages for countries, how much have actually gone into ensuring increased access to nutritious foods? If just a little amount of that money went into ensuring access to nutritious foods, if social protection programs were redesigned so that they focused on nutritious foods rather than just being generic, that I believe would be a kind of a game changer, because it's where there's so much money that's already in the system, and it's by shifting that in quite a small way that could actually have a radical impact on access to nutritious foods.
Great. And as we've seen in the UK, if you can have great footballers like Marcus Rashford intervening, it can be a further stimulus for change. Could I move now to a question from Dina Jennings, who says, the best plans can be supplanted or supplemented, I think, supplanted by poor implementation. With the challenges of cultures, regions, and governments, how do you plan to implement any plan that arises from your efforts? I suppose it's a very broad question. It's about, I suppose, how the Food System Summit might ultimately end up at a program for change, and how then could we expect that change to be actually transformed into reality? And that question was put to Lawrence.
Thank you, Tom, and it's a really good question. Every plan usually falls to pieces when it faces reality. So I really appreciate that. The way, I think the way that we're going to try and do this is by co-construction of plans. We're going to work with interested stakeholders to construct realistic, impactful plans that can be delivered. So they will be deliverable, if you like. So every one of these action track game-changing solutions, systemic solutions, it won't just be a slogan on a postcard, or in a tweet. It'll have a 50-page implementation document behind it, which looks at some of the technical issues, but more importantly, I think, or equally importantly, looks at the political issues and the capacity issues. So it's those three things coming together that makes the commitments realizable. Yes, there will have to be adjustments along the way. Reality is dynamic and fluid, and we have to constantly adapt and adjust. But by working with those who are actually responsible for implementing these plans, we hope to develop some that will survive the first encounter with political, technical, and capacity realities. Thank you, Tom.
Very relieved to hear, well, I'm not surprised to hear that this careful thinking through of how to implement reality will follow on from the Food System Summit, and we will not be having policy implementation by tweet, which would be a happy release from that particular practice, which has gained ground in recent years. A final question in this session is from Student Eats, whoever Student Eats is. Will there be a distinction in the way food is produced? Industrial agriculture, particularly of livestock, has significantly more negative climate, biodiversity, and health impacts than food produced using regenerative, agroecological, sustainable methods. In contrast, the latter can have many positive impacts on the climate, biodiversity, and health. And that is question posed to Jess and or Sheryl, so I would perhaps ask both of them to respond to it. Jess.
Great question, and I'm glad that student is eating. It's important while studying. Good. I think the writing's on the wall for many of those who work in the livestock sector, and I think we can write about the impacts that some animal production systems, and I'm saying some, for those of you who work in animal and livestock systems, they see the impacts on the environment, and I think they know more than anyone else the ramifications of certain systems on the environment, on their livelihoods, on their ability to grow as a sector moving forward. And so I think they understand sustainability and resilience issues deeply and understand that business needs to change. So there is a lot of commitments being made, a lot of technologies being applied to try to ensure that animal systems are moving towards those being more sustainable. The Food Planet Prize out of Stockholm looked at really interesting proposals, a lot of them coming from livestock sector, ocean farming, of trying to ensure these massive systems are more sustainable. So a lot of companies, a lot of ranchers, a lot of producers deeply concerned about environmental, I would say environmental more than health issues, not only for their bottom line, but for their ability to stay afloat in the next few decades. So I think we're moving towards a shift among those who actually are producers of these foods. I think they're moving faster. The dairy sector, for example, they're moving faster than us academics who write about it.
Thanks, Jess. I hadn't heard of the Food Planet Prize, but I just would refer to another competition that was run by the Rockefeller Foundation on trying to envisage sustainable food systems for 2050. And it came up with some really interesting thinking about that, about the future. Sheryl, would you like to close out our this session?
Okay, sure. So we know that they're very diverse production systems, and we certainly don't want this conversation to limit itself to production, because the food system is much broader than that. And we recognize that there's some very important upstream opportunities, particularly for livelihoods and for preserving, protecting, and ensuring nutritious and safe food. And so, yeah, the production component is important, but we need to look at what linkages there might be further along the system and how we can link that to productive livelihoods. So there's a whole action track that focuses on the production component. And so it's certainly a part of the considerations of this action track, but not the only consideration. Thanks.
Okay, Sheryl, thank you very much indeed. Okay, we're managing to stay on time, which is wonderful. And we're now moving on to the final discussion session, the final presentation on the engagement process, which is being, and the presenter here is Maureen Muketa. Maureen is a member of the leadership team of Action Track 1, but she's also the founder and executive director of Tule Vyema. So Maureen, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom, for the introduction. It's really been an engaging session, and I'm really happy to hear all the conversations that are going on. So I'll be talking about engagement. And from the previous discussions, we have seen that a food system is a web of activities that not only includes basic elements of how we get food from the farm to the fork, but it also has all the proper encompasses all the processes and infrastructure involving feeding a population. So this means a problem in the food system affects each one of us. But the good news is that anyone can be able to come up with solutions, and there is no monopoly of good ideas. Also, everyone will need to play an important role in putting these solutions into place, because we have seen they may affect each one of us. And so this makes all of us stakeholders in the process of making these solutions. So the summit, the Food System Summit, seeks to be or intends to be a people summit. We intend, or the summit implies, seeks to involve actively, to have active participation of everybody around the group. The summit seeks to have active participation from people all around the world in terms of contributing their ideas, concerns, and evidence. And in particular, this summit seeks to be very careful to have inclusion of the youth, marginalized people, the low and middle income countries, as well as communities that are not regularly engaged in these types of summits. So in Action Track 1, we have several different ways in which we are engaging beyond the summit leadership and also beyond the normal UN stakeholder engagement processes. And some of the ways in which we are engaging is that there's a Google form in which stakeholders, we have said all of us are stakeholders. So there's a Google form for stakeholders to submit their ideas on the game-changing ideas that they may have that Jess has talked about. And the link is, you can be able to submit your ideas up until end of January 2020. And then the other way in which we are engaging is Action Track 1 intends to have a series of open meetings like what we are having now and many more to come, where we will share what we are working on as Action Track 1 and seek feedback from you. The other thing that we are doing as Action Track 1 and also the Food System Summit is that there'll be a series of summit dialogues in the first half of 2021, covering all the 5 action tracks that were mentioned earlier in the call. And this aims to bring a diverse set of voices. And the summit dialogues will be held both by member states and independently organized in specific countries. And also, there will be regular blogging and speaking at different forums to share our evolving thinking in Action Track 1. And finally, the Food System Summit Secretariat will be developing an online portal for stakeholders to give feedback and engage in the discussions of the action tracks development, development in their thinking towards the summit. And finally, and this is the one take-home message I want all of us to get, is we are looking for ideas and better ways to engage with you. So there's the Google form we have talked about, and also the Food Summit dialogues that you can engage in. So kindly feel free to submit your ideas. And remember, the Google form document closes in January 2021. Thank you.
Great. Maureen, thank you very much indeed. That was really, really good. And I think it's great to somebody youthful and imaginative like you are is doing such good work in this particular area. And moving on to questions which are beginning to come in. Firstly, from Kuruba Krishnamawi, I apologize for my pronunciation, Kuruba, but anyway, your question is this. It was wonderful to hear from 4H Youth at the beginning of this meeting. Indeed, that was Janyaya. Are we missing the voice of youth and students from low and vulnerable groups at difficult to reach locations around the world? Can education play a role in creating awareness and innovative solutions to this global challenge, zero hunger? Maureen, would you like to deal with this? Because my sense coming through from the beginning is that there's a very clear commitment to try to reach out to make sure that the voice of youth is heard in this process.
Yes, thank you for that question. Yes, the Summit and Action Track 1 is seeking to incorporate everyone. And I like what the question says in terms of using education to address zero hunger. So we are encouraging you, should you have any ideas of how we can go about that, please share with us.
Okay, delighted to see a question here from my long-term friend, Stuart Gillespie. Does the summit have a conflict of interest policy regarding engagement? If so, can you share the link? And that's addressed to Lawrence.
Thank you, Tom. Hello, Stuart. Yes, there is the private sector engagement group. I answered this question in the Q&A session, in the Q&A box. Have a look. The private sector engagement group does have a principles of engagement policy. I don't know if it's published yet, but I know it's being finalized, so I guess it's not quite published yet. And the action tracks took the decision that no individual multinational corporation would be involved in the leadership team, in the 150 people that are in the leadership team in any of the action tracks. So for example, in Action Track 1, we have 6 business networks, 6 representatives from business networks. So 6 out of the 32 are from business networks. 4 of those business networks are SME networks, and 2 of them are networks of large companies, the Consumer Goods Forum and Food Industry Asia. Over.
Okay, thank you, Lawrence. In fact, you're not off the hook yet. Another question directed towards you.
Okay.
This is from Chloe McKean. Agnes Kalibata says, Agnes Kalibata obviously is the special envoy and leading this whole process of the Food System Summit. Agnes Kalibata says that the Food System Summit needs to be solutions focused. The discussion starter paper for Action Track 1 identifies the animal source food, nutrition, environment impact matrix as an example of a practical tool. Is there going to be a set of practical resources of tools that will be developed as part of Action Track 1?
I mean, I think all of the action tracks, that's a great question. I think all of the action tracks will be generating tools because they will be developing tools for their own use, and all of those tools will be open source tools. That matrix that is referred to was an example of how complex the trade-offs are, and it was a call really to our science group and to the scientists more widely in the community for evidence around trade-offs and synergies. We don't have enough evidence on the trade-offs and synergies between the 5 action track ambitions. Most of the evidence we do have comes from the high-income countries. We don't have enough from the medium and low-income countries. And so I think you might want to ask Sheryl this, Tom, because Sheryl is one of our science group representatives on the Action Track team. But I think all of the tools that we develop in Action Track 1 will be publicly available. All of the action tracks are determined to work in a transparent, open, inclusive way. So anything we produce will be out in the public domain. Over.
Yeah, that's a crucially important principle. Sheryl, would you like to comment?
No, absolutely. So the whole idea is to have these solutions science-based, admitting that there are some elements that we don't have the answers to and we don't have the data to back it up. But certainly in the science group, we've been trying to document where those gaps are, particularly where we don't have data. Some areas, for example, the food safety domain is much less documented than the nutrition domain. And finding studies that cross over the entire food system are quite tricky. So there are elements of the food system that are well covered, but finding these more system-wide approaches is something that is lacking. And certainly I think that these dialogues and discussions will lead to new directions in research and in data collection and reporting that will help countries in the future to be more accountable for these particular aspects.
Okay, thank you very much, Sheryl. I don't know whether I know
one thing about youth.
Yes, of course, Jess. Yeah.
But I don't want to let it drop so easily. I've been a bit worried about the youth engagement, and I think it's a really nice thing to see the youth engaged in some of these action tracks. But I really feel we all need to push the envoy, Agnes Kalibata, and colleagues to ensure that youth are sitting at the table at the summit and during any kind of negotiations and commitments that are made. It's nice to have a youth network, but they should be sitting right next to Agnes. Youth, marginalized populations. I saw something in the chat about civil society. Civil society, we need you to help raise the voice of some of those who have no idea that this food summit's even going on, that work in food systems or that work in the food supply chain. There's so many people that don't even know about it. So we need to get out of that kind of usual suspects sitting at the summit. That is, if we actually meet in person. Not looking good in New York right now. But, having those people sitting actually at the table with their voices heard. The networks are fine, the engagement's fine, but they need to be the decision makers at the summit, along with governments and member states. So I hope we can all of us, the 232 people sitting here, can push and give agency to those who don't even know the summit's going on or have no way of linking in to the summit. So just a call for all of us to take some responsibility on that.
Okay, Jess, thanks. Maureen, would you like to follow on from that? I mean, I know it's probably fairly close to your heart as well, what Jess has just said.
Back me up, Maureen.
Yes, I would. And I really like what Jess has said, because right now, more so in Africa, majority of the population is youth. So if they are not or if we are not involved in formulating solutions and also giving solutions from our point of view in terms of the challenges we experience, and also being given the platform to participate in sharing of ideas. I mean, in the next, now that we have the majority of the population, the solutions that are being formulated, are they the ones that will fit us? So I think it is a really good idea, Jess. And I back her up by saying, people, let's try and make this, let's scream louder.
Okay, just to be clear, Maureen is Maureen Muketa. She's the founder and executive director of Tule Vyema. What does the Tule Vyema do, Maureen?
Good question. So Tule Vyema is a Swahili word for let's eat right. So it means let's eat right. So what we do at Tule Vyema is we raise awareness of proper feeding habits in community members. So we work with young women of reproductive age to teach them proper feeding habits because of the increasing rate of non-communicable diseases. And we also help them set up vertical gardens or sack farms where they cultivate indigenous vegetables for their consumption and sale of surplus. Indigenous vegetables because they're nutrient-dense foods, but they're not readily available. So how we try and offer the solution is by training the women to cultivate these indigenous vegetables.
That sounds really important work. And so I would encourage everybody, do you have a website?
Not yet.
Not yet, okay.
It's under construction, but we have social media pages.
Okay, so that's one of the follow-up actions from this call, no doubt. I don't know, is Jamie back? I know he had to leave for another meeting. Is he back yet?
Yes, he's back.
Oh, then you've arrived just at the right time, Jamie, because we've two questions for you. The first one is from, so there were two anyway. Yeah, from Precious Fury. What sort of movements are active within the summit as part of their mandate to keep our governments accountable as far as food safety and nutrition solutions are concerned? And the second question is from Pat McMahon. Is the engagement process the same for each of the 5 action tracks?
Okay, thanks, Tom. So maybe taking Pat's first, because I think then I can lead on to Precious's question. Yes, in essence, the process for each of the 5 action tracks will be the same. Of course, there will be variations around the theme, but in terms of the way that the membership is being set up in a representative manner, the deliverables that we're expecting, the timeline against which they will deliver. You know, for example, we'll be having open fora such as this one for each of the action tracks between now and mid-December. Those dates are yet to be announced. They will be announced on the summit website, and I'll put that in the link shortly, so you can get more information on not just on the action tracks, but also on the summit as a whole. And then in terms of Precious's comment about movements becoming active within the summit process, I completely agree with Jess's previous comments about the need for all groups to be included. And I think the way that the process has been set up allows for that. But we clearly need to communicate with different communities, with different abilities to participate, particularly while we're working in a virtual world. I think that's another important consideration. How do we reach out to those who are not digitally connected? The action tracks are one component. As I mentioned at the beginning, the Food System Summit dialogues are another component of this process, which will interact and feed information back and forth with the action tracks. And I think these provide a real basis for any community, any interest group, any movement to convene their own dialogues, addressing the issues which are priorities for them, working out what sort of solutions would work for them, and then feeding that information back into the process. So I think there are many opportunities to influence the thinking of governments, but not just of governments, but also of other food system stakeholder constituencies, whether they be other parts of civil society, whether they be business, international organizations, or indeed government.
Okay.
Thank you,
Jamie,
Tom.
there's a great appetite for your wisdom, because there are two more questions now that I'd like to put to you. First from Marcus Lopez. How is the CFS civil society mechanism engaged on action track leadership and on the summit itself? And then a question from Alexandra Mora, and this also directed to Sheryl. The ongoing CFS process to develop recommendations on food systems for nutrition shows that governments might be reluctant to implement some solutions because of lack of evidence base. Would the game-changing solutions be based on evidence? I would have thought yes. And what should be considered as scientific evidence? So firstly, the CFS civil society mechanism.
Okay, yeah. CFS process, we've engaged, as the Food Systems Summit Secretariat, engaged very closely with the CFS Secretariat and the chair of the CFS to see how we make best use of that process. And make best use of that process in a way that we're not duplicating efforts, but we're allowing these different processes and spaces to come together to ensure that we really do have the voice of a wide constituency, but coming in through different processes. The CFS has generated a number of highly relevant products over the past 3 years, which from conceptualizing what food systems are to looking at different dimensions of around solutions in terms of moving food system transformation forward. Those products are highly relevant and need to be incorporated into our thinking as we move the process forward. But in relation to the second question, there are also ongoing processes of negotiations under the CFS. One of those is obviously the voluntary guidelines on food systems and nutrition, where there is, and this has been referred to in the question, some evidence of difficulties for different countries to come to agreement around some fairly fundamental issues. Now, whilst the Food Systems Summit process, and we're working towards this summit in 2021, is fully conversant with the ongoing discussions in the CFS, we felt that it was important to create a gap between that, because the Food Systems Summit will not reach a negotiated outcome. We're looking for solutions which can be operationalized. We're not necessarily looking to reach an outcome document which is negotiated by all partners. So we have two different processes, but clearly interactions, and clearly we can learn from what is happening in the ongoing discussions in CFS and ensure that the way we move forward is conversant with those discussions, but also doesn't create tensions in a way that would prevent particular solutions from being implemented.
Okay, and then I know that Sheryl has had long-standing connections with the CFS and the high-level panel of experts there. Do you have a comment then, Sheryl, please?
Yes, sure. So the recent reports by the high-level panel of experts are a very important base from which we work and certainly feed into the discussion. And there are members from that committee who are part of the science committee as well. But the science committees of each of the action tracks have very strict and clear instructions to make sure that we do provide the science base. And while we recognize that some of that evidence is thin in some parts, the entire system will also be looking at some of the research. What indicators do we use? So it refers to one of the questions in the Q&A about how will we define those game changers. That's what we're in the process of doing. And collectively, the action tracks are identifying the specific indicators that will be used to conduct analysis. So we're basing what we are evaluating as solutions on existing knowledge, but we will also be generating new knowledge to guide the conversation. So I think it's an extremely exciting moment to be involved in these kind of discussions.
Okay, we're getting close to the end, but we've time for a couple more questions. I want to get the absolute maximum value out of this session. A question from Ed Bourgeois. Why no mention of leading farmers who are working on these issues being identified and brought to the table? And that question is directed to Lawrence.
There are quite a few farmer groups engaged in the action tracks. And of course, the food system dialogues, the food system summit dialogues will engage lots of farmers groups as well. So I think that will be the case. For Action Track 1, we're currently engaging with Esther Penunia from the Asian Farmers Association to get one member of that association as part of the leadership team for Action Track 1. But I think the message has come through very loud and clear from all the summit organizers that we have to talk directly to farmers and farmers associations. And the vice chair in Action Track 2 is also Ajay, is a leader in farmers groups. So the voices are there. Over.
Okay, and another question, which I think is again a good question, from Lucy Westerman: how can we mitigate risks of, in inverted commas, health/greenwashing through the principles of engagement? Lawrence, do you have?
Well, I think this is something we just have to be vigilant about and be clear about. And this is I guess Lucy has companies in mind, but it could be governments or civil society groups that are seeking to appear to be doing good while on the surface not really doing anything. So we've got strong accountability mechanisms to make sure that any commitments that are made are real commitments, and they are significant commitments, and they are evidence-based commitments, and we have strong principles of engagement. So I think it's one of these things that you can if you develop rules for them, you can only go so far. You've got to be constantly vigilant and constantly transparent. And that's why, sunlight is the best disinfectant. We're going to try and be as transparent as possible on all of this.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. Very, very important principle. We have a little bit of time for questions that were asked a bit earlier we didn't get to at the time. But one from Omar, which says, farming is perceived by many young people as old-fashioned and offering little opportunity for a productive future. So they seek well-paid jobs in towns and cities. With less workforce, how can we ensure zero hunger? Will increasing youth engagement in designing, co-producing knowledge, providing solutions, also by way of involving youth in the summit, be a good way to tackle that? And that question was addressed to Godfrey and or Jess. So Godfrey, would you like to have a first contribution to it?
Thank you. I think this question is a recurring question around getting youth into agriculture. And I think we need evidence, because from where I come, and that is Uganda, quite a lot of youth are involved in agriculture. Okay, so I think it is not exactly true. You cannot make a generalization that youth are shunning agriculture. Okay, quite a lot of them are within the sector, and if they are not involved in primary production, they are involved in other secondary aspects of the value chain. What I cannot give is the statistics, because I don't have such information, certainly not enough across different countries. But I think it is, to me, a researchable question. But it's not true that youth are not involved in agriculture in Africa. It's not true.
Okay, thank you. And maybe the final word in this section to Jess, as the along with Maureen, the youth spokesperson for today. Jess.
Maybe Jess can contradict what I just said.
No, I completely agree.
I mean, Maureen, sorry.
I agree with Godfrey. I mean, I think we need to shift that average age of the world's farmer and producer. But I think, agriculture, fisher folk, the whole producer in the many vast forms, whether it's a farmer, or pastoralist, or a fisherwoman, it's changing. And I think some of what's bringing youth back along with those who are working in the middle part of the value chain where there's probably more income to be made at value, is some technologies. We're seeing some pretty game-changing technologies that are reducing the drudgery of farming, giving farmers, producers, fisher folk, they can be more nimble, whether it's digital technologies to forecast better, whether it's artificial intelligence, whether it's drones. The question then becomes for some of these technologies is, are they justifiable? Are they acceptable? Are they infringing on any kind of autonomy issues with producers? So we need to move forward delicately with some of these technologies, but for some of them, they are changing the way farming is done, which makes them much more attractive to younger people who saw their grandparents working on shambas and struggled to make ends meet. So I think that technology is going to be an important piece, but with that comes new complexities of ownership, ensuring that we're not infringing on indigenous people's rights. So we have to move forward delicately with those, but they could be potential game changers that hopefully we'll all discuss next year.
Yeah, again, very wise counsel there. I think really the final word in this session, I think, should properly go to Maureen, who opened it. So Maureen, is there any last thing you'd like to say as part of this heading under process?
Yes, I'd like to agree. I agree with what Godfrey and Jess have said, and we need to encourage more youth, not to say that they're not engaging in agriculture, but to try and position themselves in different aspects of the value chain, because agriculture is not only in the production, but again, as Jess has said, we are seeing more development and more improvements, which are now becoming more attractive to the youth. Because why you find youth not wanting to engage in agriculture is they have to wait for a long period of time for them to get profits or harvest whatever they cultivated. But now with new technology, with emerging technology, it's becoming more attractive to the youth. So let's also encourage them to position themselves in different aspects of the value chain and embrace the new technologies that are coming in carefully, as Jess has said.
Okay. Maureen, thank you very much for bringing this session, this third discussion session, to a close. And we're now on to the final remarks, which are to close the overall forum, which we're going to go to Sheryl and to Lawrence. So Sheryl, would you like to go first?
Thank you so much, Tom, and thank you, participants, for the amazing range of questions. You've put us on our toes, and there's certainly lots to discuss after this discussion. I came away with a couple of keywords, being equity, inclusive, incentives, and place. So clearly many of the points that you put forward, the questions you asked, related to equity and how we're going to deal with the inequalities, but also trying to create some kind of redistribution in the system, considering the very complex trade-offs that will accompany any particular change or shift in the food system. But it's very clear that COVID makes this more obvious, and it's something that cannot be ignored. So linked to that equity, I think, is the crucial component that we've been talking about, and that is the inclusiveness of the process. So you mentioned quite clearly in many of the questions and comments relating to including people with disabilities, a greater voice for youth. And this really then lies not just with us, but with all of you participating in this conversation, because you have access to networks that need to be alerted to this process. It's an open public process. There will be many opportunities for engagement. And so it's for each of us to mobilize our own networks and get people involved so that the voices are there. So I think a fairly equitable platform has been created, except perhaps access to technology, but we'll have to think cleverly about how we can reach people who don't have such great connectivity or access. But Lawrence, I know, is very active on social platforms, so can probably come up with a clever idea of how we can do this. So inclusiveness is very important. The incentives come up quite clearly on how we create behavior change, not just in consumers or producers, but in everybody in the food system. And so Karina made the point that many things we thought were impossible are suddenly possible, and we've seen people changing habits that are deeply entrenched by culture, society, and habit through the COVID pandemic. And so how do we create these incentives? So in the ideas that you submit, it would be very helpful not only to know the solutions, but the how to actually get that behavior change. What are the incentives to drive individuals to change, to drive companies to change, for various different groups to be able to mobilize civil society and action and accountability in those systems? The other component that came out quite clearly was the place issue. Quite a few comments about urban food systems and not forgetting about these comments from Jess in terms of the informal sector and not forgetting that component. But also recognition and respect for tradition. In an engagement that we had last week with ambassadors in Rome, it was very clear that countries wanted traditional food systems to be carefully considered in these, and the opportunities that traditional food systems offer, not only for livelihoods, but also for nutrition. And so there was another question that we didn't get to address, and that was about national food policies. And we do believe that these are crucial, but we'll have to think carefully about just adding another layer to government policy. So first we have nutrition policy, then we ask for a food security policy, now we're asking for a food systems policy. So how do we bring all these components together in a comprehensive way that governments are able to tackle these issues? So when we have these system-wide issues, it becomes more complex. So I think I will leave my comments there, but ideas and suggestions are extremely welcome and would really, really help to shape the considerations that we make going from here, and also our understanding of the systems and what drives them. Thank you so much, Tom.
Great, Sheryl, and good luck with the tremendously important work on the scientific group, which of course is led by Joachim van Braun. So let's say this committee is in very safe hands. Lawrence, would you like to conclude? And I know you wanted to talk a little bit more about youth.
That's fine, Tom. I will do that another time. And let me just on youth. Let me just say we've invited Eleni Gabra-Medin to be part of the leadership team, and she runs a startup that helps other startups in Ethiopia with, and they're all youth-based startups in the food and ag space with a focus on nutritious food. So Eleni is going to be a big champion of making agriculture relevant and exciting for youth. Of course, the most exciting way, the best way of making it exciting is to make it a profitable and sustainable livelihood. But I just wanted to thank everybody on the line, all of you, for some really great comments, really great questions. You've been really generous with your ideas, with your opinions, and with your links and contacts. And we're overwhelmed by the generosity of your responses. Thank you. I'd like to thank the presenters and my vice chairs and the presenters. You know, none of us are getting paid to do this. This is all pro bono work. We're doing it because we think it's really important. We think we've got a massive opportunity to make a change. The thing that comes through very clearly to me from the presenters, from the questions, from the audience, from the comments, from you, Tom, is the passion that's out there. And I think that's appropriate because this is not the usual summit. I've been to many summits. I've come away from most of them disappointed and deflated and demoralized. This is going to be different. This summit is reaching parts that other summits won't reach. It's actively reaching out to unusual suspects, people who are not usually part of the dialogue. We're trying very hard to do that. It's not going to be a blah, blah, blah summit. It's going to be an action-oriented solutions summit. The actions, the solutions that are proposed are not simply captured in a tweet. They will have a serious investable proposition document behind them. There will be a serious accountability mechanism tracking them. There will be faming of the ones who are doing well, and there will be questions as to why the commitments that were made are not being followed up on. So stick with us, folks. We'll be doing a few more of these over the next few months. Stick with us. We're determined to show you our working as we go along. We're determined that we don't have all the answers, that many people out there have much better answers than we do. Our job is to collate, aggregate, curate, and help sift the answers, and then build momentum and commitment around them so that they are actionable, operationalizable, impactful actions that are going to change people's lives. So please stick with us. Together we can change food systems for the better. We can change them for the next generation, and we can change them for everybody. So finally, let me just say thank you to Tom. I thought you've curated this and shared this brilliantly with lots of wisdom, Tom. So thank you so much. Over.
Lawrence, thank you very much indeed. Well, look, I think it's been a great session. I really have enjoyed it. Sheryl came up with 4 words that she felt characterized the session. The one word that I came away with was energy. Energy, the sense of commitment that people had contributing. But perhaps it needs to be linked to the other word that Lawrence used, passion. So if those 2 words, energy and passion, can continue to be the basis for the work we're going to do over the next year or so, we have a chance indeed of making this summit something different than ever before. I want to thank in particular at the end of this 2 hours, and we are finishing on time, I want to thank Stella. All those very finely crafted questions which I posed to you were all presented to me on a plate or on my iPhone by Stella, who's done a great job. So thank you, Stella. You've been indispensable to making this session as productive and as much fun as it has been. Thank you, everybody who participated, and I hope the next session, we look forward to the next session.
Thank you to Anouk for all the work behind the scenes, yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you, Anouk. Okay, Lawrence, we're done.
Thanks,
okay.
Tom.
Thank
everyone.
Bye-bye.